So that does take us to the next section, which is on transitions and post-school. So this is a question for Debbie and Dawn. My son says he's stupid, and I think he will struggle to push himself when he leaves school because his self-esteem is so low.
I think
hear this a lot.
I think I'd be able to answer this more as a parent of a dyslexic young person rather than a teacher, although I do use him quite often to say to parents, you know, they do, and it doesn't matter how much scaffolding you put around a young person, or you know how much you boost their self-esteem. I know all that from my training, but they do. I remember Innes coming home and saying, even so-and-so can read better than me, mum. And you can imagine who that kid was in his class, you know, and he knew that he was intelligent and he knew that he was bright, but he could not understand why he couldn't do something that everybody else seemed to take in their stride. I think as a parent, you have to find what they're good at. You have to find their strengths. Mine was Innes was sport. I threw everything at him. He now coaches sport. He coaches football. He coaches sailing, you know, and he maintains that was his salvation. That was how he survived school, as he puts it. You would know you're a teacher for a mum, but I think you need to find what their strengths are and encourage them to do lots of that. And it's not necessarily sport. It could be even their interpersonal skills and supporting other young people. It could be anything, you know, but schools are quite good at finding that in young people. Parents have to find that as well and push them. And celebrating the successes, but as we discussed, it has to be real successes. These kids are not daft. You know, they know that their story is not as great as the next person's story, but they're playing their football game might be better than the other person. So they have to have true praise for what they are good at and try and focus their attention on that. And it's a really difficult balancing act. But you have to just keep going, striving for it.
I think as well, although we spoke way back at the start, and I've mentioned throughout that the Scottish education system is needs-led and is not label-driven, this is where it's really important when you have somebody who's dyslexic to give them that label and get that understanding of why they are the way they are, but also be looking through that pathway of getting that absolute profile of them that builds on not just the needs and the challenges that we're going to support, but the strengths that are there, so we can build on them, so we can celebrate them, so we can give them that focus. Within, you know, the education, we're very literacy driven, but when you go into the world of work, it's much wider. And just as you said there, Dawn, thinking about, you know, that sport, that drive, that was what worked for him, and saying, you know, look at the opportunities that are there when you leave. And I think it's having those, that realization of what they're really good at, building on that so they've got that balance. I've also seen some really nice work within schools where they're looking at supports that perhaps young people have used within their class, and it's worked for them, that they then become the almost the mentor and the role model that goes on and teaches other young people how to use these supports. So it again gives them that responsibility and does wonders sometimes for their self-esteem, that they can see that they're not, there's others that are like them, that they can show them how they can overcome the challenges, and they've got that understanding, and quite often they know how to work these tools far better than somebody else explaining it, because they're using it on a daily basis, that they can give that real in-depth knowledge and pass it on to other learners.
It just reminded me of the lad I was talking about earlier that's got quite severe dyslexia. He was working with one of our admin teachers, and she was showing him some more different sort of techniques and things to use with the computer. He's just been down the stairs supporting my primary 7 transition group that are pulling together their PowerPoint presentation, and that's been brilliant for his self-esteem and for his kudos, because he does struggle every day in school. But just having that, you know, I've got to go and buy a box of chocolates on my way home. Forgot about that as well. It's good for him.
Yeah, thank you. And it is a massive area, and there's not always easy answers, but I think that's some really good advice. I think the penultimate question here is people talk about they don't know enough about support for their children in further higher education, especially if they've had, you know, very good sport in school, if they've been used to that. So somebody has said, you know, what help is out there and when should they start asking for it? So I'm going to ask Fran to answer that, please.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be aware that, you know, if a young person's been identified with requiring additional support, they are entitled to transition support. So there should be effective transition planning in place. And for some learners, that may look and take place over a period of 2 years prior to them leaving school. For probably the majority of learners, it's a year, but that's an entitlement. It can be difficult in a secondary setting because sometimes a young person, when they're legally allowed to leave school, can leave school, make that choice, and we don't actually have time because we think they're going to, for example, stay on till 6th year. That's what they've maybe said. And then all of a sudden they can come back and say, no, I've decided I'm going to leave in 5th year. And so you can be slightly caught out with that transition planning. And I'm just being very honest with that. But there should be effective transition support. And one thing I would definitely recommend families to be aware of when you move to further education or higher education, you as the parent is not the person that the establishment will be linking with. It is that young person. They've moved into adulthood. But there's absolutely nothing to stop you making contact with the establishments, even if you don't know which one it's going to be, if it's university, for example, and you're going through that UCAS form and you don't know which one they're going to be accepted for, contact them all. Go on their website, look at their student support. Sometimes they're called disability office, but see what supports are available, what's their processes. They are equally, just as school education is, they have a responsibility to provide support if the evidence is there. But if they don't know that their incoming students require support, they won't have things set up in place. And I know that sounds really obvious, but it's important that the learner begins to take ownership of their own learning. So what should happen is when through that transition planning, or when the learner leaves school, you as a family, but particularly the learner, because it's their learning plan, it's their paperwork, they should have a copy of it, and hopefully an electronic copy as well as a paper copy. The very nature of dyslexia means that we can forget them, we can lose them. Really helpful to have a backup, because the college or the university will be asking for it. And I've spoken and I've met, and through the Making Sense programme, disability advisors, student support advisors, and they get equally as frustrated because they'll be contacting that individual and they may not get any responses from the emails. They might get a response, but they might not get the paperwork back. So it's really important that whatever the post-school is sort of destination is going to be, whether that's actually workplace or FE or HE, as in further education or higher education, that on the application form, they make it very clear that they have received support for their additional support needs. For some learners, if their dyslexia is significant, they will be covered by the Equality Duty Act. Not all dyslexic individuals are, because it's a continuum of support. So you tick that disability box. That might need a bit of a conversation, because some people will be really uncomfortable about disclosing that. They really might feel uncomfortable about using the term. I use it whenever I put an application form on, because I'm significantly dyslexic. But I always think, well, that's easy for me because I'm much older. When you're a young person, they'll have a different viewpoint. But as I said, if the university or the college don't know, then they won't. It takes a longer time period to set things in place. It is quite normal, just to be prepared for you, that when you're actually in the institution, certain supports may not be in place until you've been there for a good few months anyway. And that's when you've already disclosed. You may have already shared, that identification process from school. You may have, an independent one. But it's really important that you do a bit of research, find out what it is that individual establishment is looking for, because they will have their own process in place. And as I say, can't stress enough, make sure that you have a copy of the paperwork. You know, you should have, as a parent, for any pupil support meeting that you attend, you should have a copy of that paperwork anyway. And these days that is sent out normally electronically. And very much really important for that whole identification pathway, which includes the, if you like, the SQA assessment arrangements that are in place. That really valuable piece of information for college and for university. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else.
We do that as an automatic thing, Fran, in our secondary. So any pupils that have had additional support for their exams or assessment arrangements have a letter stating that. Parents or young people can also give the receiving university or college permission to contact school. So if they give permission, they can email us and then we can send it digitally. I'm going to give you another example for Innes. So when he was in 5th and 6th year, he applied to do an engineering course with a college partnership thing with school, and he went for his interview, and I said, how did it go? What did they ask you? Do you know? And he says, oh, it sounds like there's an awful lot of writing, mum, and this, that, and the next thing. I said, well, don't worry. Once you get the place, I'll contact the school and make sure they know that you're dyslexic. He says, oh, they know I'm dyslexic. I said, well, how's that? He says, well, you told me they make good engineers, so that was the first thing I told them in my interview, that I had dyslexia. There's a little bit there about young people owning it as well, and being proud of it to an extent. And I was dead chuffed when he came home with that story.
Absolutely, and actually, you raised a really, really good point there, Dawn, because if there is an interview process, whether there's a task or whether it's a written task, a verbal task, really, really important that the learner's needs are explained to that establishment or to that workplace, because otherwise, just as you would with an SQA exam, you're not on a level playing field if you don't get those support. So it's perfectly, if your dyslexia is significant enough, you are entitled, even through an interview activity, for extra time, access to IT. So I think for me, it's about supporting our learners to have that confidence within themselves, want to understand what they need, why they need it, so they can make sure going forward they'll ask for it.
I've actually just added it. I was supporting somebody for a forum for Taekwondo, actually, and there was a bit about medical needs, but there wasn't anything about learning difficulties, and I've added that in just to see what would happen. And interestingly, I was just aware, because of my experience in support needs, I think I was aware that a couple of them were showing signs of autism. I thought, actually, that makes a difference to how you might deal with young people. So I've just added it in, and I do a lot of scouts in my free time as well, and I'm aware of that. I happen to know the kids in front of me, that a few of them have dyslexia, so I'm able to change things up when required. But I thought it's not in their application form. It's really important that we, outside of education, groups are aware of these difficulties that young people might have and how to support them.
Absolutely agree.
But on that note of consensus, is there anything else that any of you would like to add to the answers you've given before I sum up?
I think just communication's the key, isn't it? I think schools are busy places, and we're not always great at remembering to communicate, and we're working with lots of young people. So, just keep asking, where are we with this assessment? What about this difficulty? And don't think that, you're just reminding us, you're not annoying us. You're reminding us that we need to keep communicating with parents. And I think from my experience working with a support group as well, that seems to be where the problems lie often. Schools will be doing things to support your young people, but they're maybe not so good at telling the parents, and vice versa. Their parents are seeing difficulties that the school maybe don't see or aren't aware of. So it's about, keeping that communication going.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, Dawn. And the pandemic has brought challenges in a way we've never seen before. And it would be unrealistic to expect that there isn't perhaps a backlog of assessment requests. Schools are struggling with staff absences. During the lockdowns, staff could not get into schools, specialist staff. There was, even to do any observations. So the methodology of going through an assessment process had to change. So where there are some advantages of things that we've learned by being able to do things virtually, that there clearly have been real difficulties because of the pandemic. And we know that more families have become aware of the difficulties their children experience. And as Dawn said, if that communication wasn't there before the pandemic on what supports were in place, understandably, the family may think that there were no supports in place. And sometimes, please don't underestimate that the learner themselves may not be aware of the supports that are in place because it's done very sensitively. So it is very complex.
I think just to add to what Dawn had mentioned earlier about putting something in writing to reinforce, I think just now especially, we're still coming out of the pandemic and there's still those limitations of footfall within schools. So things like so many things have become remote, and when you're doing that remote parents' night, for example, the time is quite often time limited, so you don't get to have that extended conversation, whether it's because the system that's being used, parents you're perhaps only getting that short amount, that window, or you're just more aware of the time when you're on, that sometimes that communication, although it can feel you're being much more formal, is still invaluable and keeps those lines of communication open when you can't have that face-to-face contact, which the majority of schools are desperate to get back to when we can. But in that interim, having that two-way dialogue, whether it is through emails or telephone calls when we can't have that face-to-face, is really the best way forward, because then both sides know what's happening and it's that two-way, so we're getting the best picture of the child and the best supports going in for the child in that universal way, in that holistic way.
Thank you so much, Debbie, Fran and Dawn. I hope that parents, I'm sure that parents will find what you have, the answers you've given to all the questions that we frequently hear from parents will be really useful. And the benefit of having it recorded is obviously parents can wind back and just listen to the kind of the answers that maybe they didn't catch the first time round. So thank you so much for doing this recording at the end of your school day, right in the middle of a very, very busy time. So this has been recorded just before the Easter holidays, and really appreciate the time and the commitment you've given to explaining what is a very complex process, and which understandably became very difficult for parents to understand. So thank you very much. I hope that the parents watching this find it useful. It may also have been useful for some teachers to listen to the answers as well. We will be putting a slide up with some links and some phone numbers, but just so you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, our helpline is open every day, Monday to Friday, and the details for that with phone number will be on the slide that follow. Our website, dyslexiascotland.org.uk, has a wealth of information, including leaflets, films, recordings, lots of different information, and Dyslexia Scotland YouTube channel, and incorporated in the Dyslexia Scotland website from April 2022 onwards will be a section for young people, especially, which has been moved over from Dyslexia Unwrapped. So there's lots of very helpful information on that. When we talked about self-esteem earlier, there's lots of really, really useful clips of young people talking about what their dyslexia means to them. So I do advise you to suggest that your children and young people do actually look at that part of the website. There are also, for those who are leaving school, who are going into the adult world, there is a very useful pack on the website called the Post-Assessment Pack for adults, and there's lots of information for there at the different stages of assessment and support. So without further ado, just want to thank everyone here again. Thank you, Lena, for organising today's recording. Thank you, Fran, Dawn and Debbie for a really useful website. And parents, do please come back and ask us any questions if we haven't answered them all tonight. Thank you.